Russia's war in Ukraine is having a major impact on food supply, both in and outside of the country. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization is sounding the alarm. It says 1/3 of Ukraine's crops may be lost this year. That's about the amount of last year's wheat crop that could go unharvested. A similar amount of corn and sunflower is likely to go unplanted this spring. That's because much of Ukraine's farmland lies in the war zone. Many farm workers have fled, and there are shortages of fuel, fertilizer, and seeds. Ukraine exports about 10% of the world's wheat and 12% of corn. Much of it goes to African countries. Ukraine is also the world's biggest producer of sunflower oil, accounting for 52% of all global exports in recent years. In our next report, we meet a farmer in Ukraine who explains the challenges that workers like him face in the midst of war. On a reporting trip organized by Ukrainian forces, DW's Matthias Berlinger met a demining group that is turning its attention to the country's fields.
The war has left its traces on Alexander Fishun's property. Alexander is a farmer on the outskirts of Kiev. He owns 1,000 hectares of farmland and agricultural machinery. But his business has been in ruins since Russian troops entered the village at the beginning of March. A burnt-out armored vehicle sits where his harvesters used to be.
They came to the gate and began rattling. My workers were inside the farm. When they realized the troops were barging through the gate, they ran over there across the fence into the village. Thank God they're all alive.
The Russian forces installed themselves inside the facility and Alexander fled to Kiev. The Russian troops had occupied this place for around 3 weeks, and when they left, they blew up this place. Now Alexander is picking up the pieces. It's not just his farmhouse that was destroyed. The fighting has also affected his farmland. It is littered with unexploded ordnance.
The minesweepers haven't been here yet, so we don't dare go out. We can't work at the moment.
Demining brigades are out and about, but for now they're establishing the damage. They haven't even started demining agricultural land. For this year's harvest, it might be too late. The sowing season is nearing its end. And the military administration has little hope they will be able to help in time.
We demine the roads and houses first, social facilities like schools, the things that are needed so people can more or less walk around normally. We do the fields only after we've done that first.
He guesses it might take years for agriculture to get back to normal. Meanwhile, the winter wheat is growing. Alexander sowed it before the war.
We've flown drones over the field and where we see traces of vehicles. My workers have been searching for mines with metal detectors. But we need clearance for the whole field. We don't know what's lying in there. And we'll have to wait for the minesweeping team to confirm that the field is safe.
The consequences of this war will continue to be felt far and wide, as Ukraine has been feeding the world for decades.
For more, let's bring in Josef Schmidhuber of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO. He is the Deputy Director of the FAO's Food and Markets Division. Thanks for joining us. Dr. Schmidhuber, we're seeing food shortages and rising prices around the globe now due to the war in Ukraine. Tell us more about how this crisis is impacting different world regions.
Yeah, perhaps it's easier to look at consumers and producers. As far as consumers are concerned, they're ubiquitously negatively affected. So they face a lot more to spend on food, and not only on food, but also on other basic necessities, notably on fuel and fuel for heating, for cooking, and for transportation. So that leaves a lot less money for other important issues, notably for health and education of the children. And the poorest consumers are the hardest hit, because they spend a lot more on their incomes than the rich consumers. So most of the hardest hit countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are also countries in the nearest North African region, the NENA region, that are heavily food importing countries, and they are, as a country, very strongly affected.
So Africa being very strongly affected. What can be done to ease these food shortages and stabilize the supply?
Yeah, I think it is very important to keep food markets open. So the worst thing that can happen is that countries start to put their feet on the brake and essentially stop exports. So export restrictions, export taxes, all measures that reduce exports are really detrimental to international price stability, and countries should steer clear of these. At the same time, I think it's important that untargeted consumer subsidies are being reduced. Take Egypt, for instance. In Egypt, a particular type of bread costs just a fraction of what the wheat costs to produce that bread. And that leads to a lot of waste and a lot of use as bread as animal feed. So these things are certainly not useful. We at FAO, we have come up with I think a very interesting proposal for an international food import financing facility. So this would essentially afford the poorest countries with high import needs access to credit markets so that they can actually buy the food on the international market without driving up prices when they do that.
Now, some analysts say that the war in Ukraine could drag on for months, if not years. What should we prepare for in the short and medium term regarding food supplies and the price of staples?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. Nobody can predict prices, and I'm certainly not going to do that. But there are signs that markets will not find back into usual equilibria as quickly as they normally do. We have this old adage in agriculture or in commodity markets saying essentially that the best cure against high prices are high prices and the best cure against low prices are low prices. But that is not going to happen at the moment. Why? Because agricultural prices or food prices are largely determined by energy and particularly fertilizer prices. And there is no reason, no sign to assume that fertilizer prices will come down. That essentially means as long as fertilizer prices are high, farmers will be hesitant to use the normal amounts of fertilizer. And that means lower production going into 2022, 2023. And that is particularly pronounced for commodities where prices are still well behaved, like for rice. So what we call affordability, fertilizer affordability for rice is at an all-time low, meaning that farmers have no incentive to use the normal amounts of fertilizers. And as we've seen in Sri Lanka, for instance, that can lead to crop failures, to very low returns. And if that is a harbinger for the rest of Asia, we could actually see a full-blown food crisis in 2022, 2023.
Dr. Schmidhuber, thank you very much for talking with us. That was Josef Schmidhuber from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization.
Thanks for having me.